Well, if there was any kind of silver lining for parents in 2020, it was that COVID didn't seem to be very good at infecting kids and teenagers. But in 2021, the Delta variant has put kids right on the pandemic's front line.
COVID is no longer a disease of the elderly. In Melbourne's current outbreak, almost half of all cases are aged 18 and under. In New South Wales, it's around 30%. Similar rises are happening globally as a result of the Delta variant.
We have a large number of children focusing on this particular outbreak, all examples of where children have transmitted, both within their households or between themselves, both at school and in other settings.
While young people are more at risk of catching COVID, thankfully hospitalisations remain rare.
What we're seeing coming out of the US is very concerning. Although only 1 in a few thousand children will die from the Delta variant, we're seeing 1 in 100 ending up in hospital very sick.
But data from overseas shows that young people can be just as susceptible to the effects of long COVID, even if their initial infection is completely asymptomatic.
About 7% are going on to develop what we call long COVID symptoms. Some children who've never had learning difficulties before are suddenly really falling behind. Problems with memory, the brain fog that's described, where they just really can't focus on things.
As for a vaccination program for kids, planning is underway for 12 to 15-year-olds. Currently, only Indigenous kids and those with pre-existing conditions can be vaccinated in this age group.
We still do not have the definitive medical advice from ATAGI on that yet. The interim advice is imminent, and that will help with that planning, but I don't anticipate that to be finalised for about another week or so.
Trials of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in kids down to 6 months are underway overseas, with results expected in October. However, some countries have started mass vaccinating children already. The US is planning to start vaccinating all kids down to 4 by around Christmas.
It would be devastating and an enormous mistake if Australia was to expose 100% of children under the age of 12 and many under the age of 16 to COVID. This so-called 80% target is ignoring children completely. We really need to fight for our kids now. This is a fight for the children of Australia.
Well, Associate Professor Margie Danchin is from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and she joins us now. Professor, so we're talking about 80% vaccination rates being the target, but that's only 80% of over 16s in this country. There are almost 5 million kids under 16 who aren't included in those numbers. So should we be easing restrictions and exposing so many kids to COVID when they won't yet be vaccinated?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Unfortunately, we're seeing the rollout in Australia now really picking up pace, with around 50% of adults having had 1 dose and about 30% 2 doses. But actually, with the cases in children under the age of 18 now, we're seeing that most of them are acquired in the household or the community, not in schools. So what that actually tells us is that vaccinating adults and pushing the vaccination coverage in adults is actually really important to indirectly protect kids. But it's not only adults in households, it's their teachers and the childcare workers, and also having a really comprehensive plan around schools, as well as vaccinating adolescents that will scaffold them. So there's a lot that we can be doing now as we're preparing to increase coverage in adolescents.
So what do we know so far about kids and the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines?
Well, the Pfizer vaccine has been extensively tested in a large phase 3 clinical trial in the US of over 2,000 adolescents, 12 to 15 years, and it actually showed that the vaccine was 100% effective against severe disease. They did identify a serious side effect, inflammation of the heart or the lining around the heart, called myocarditis and pericarditis, which is one adverse event that we are following closely, which we can talk about, but it's actually quite mild and self-limited, fortunately. But it is something that parents need to be aware about in young men and boys. And we're still waiting for the clinical trial data in the under 12, so in primary school age children and preschool children, which hopefully will start getting some data by the end of September, and then we can make decisions about vaccinating that age group early next year.
Professor, given that children haven't been the focus of testing or vaccination till now, is there a risk that there's a bigger burden of long COVID in kids than we know?
Well, long COVID in children is actually a really interesting question because, as we know, 10 to 30% of adults can have chronic symptoms for 8 weeks or more. But the data in children so far is actually really reassuring that maybe only around 2% of children will experience chronic symptoms or long COVID for 8 weeks or more. But that is something that we're looking at very closely with the Delta variant, and there's a lot of research ongoing in that space.
All right, Margie, we will have to leave it there. Really appreciate your insight. Thanks so much.
No problems. Thanks for having me.
So, PVO, you've got 2 daughters, 12 and 14. How are you feeling about all this?
Really scared for them. I mean, Ainsley and I we're double vaxxed, so we're not worried about us, but them, they're the reason that we're worried to go out. You know, we know that we're less likely to catch it for being vaccinated, but they don't have vaccines. They're so young, and the last thing we want to do is to infect either of them, knowing that somewhere between, 2 and 7% of people, kids that get COVID end up with long COVID and all the difficulties of that.
Yeah,
it's frightening. It's really frightening.
Even if they're asymptomatic initially, which is kind of the terrifying part.
Yeah, and as a result, you know, it's hard at every level because you wrap them up in cotton wool, keep them at home. I'm the biggest risk because Ainsley can work from home most of the time. I'm the one that has to go out occasionally. But even then, I recognise for most parents, they're at bigger risk than we are because a lot of people have to go out and work much more than I do, certainly much more than Ainsley does as well in terms of being out of the house. And, you know, we wrap them up in cotton wool, but by the same token, that means that they're not seeing their friends. And you even worry that as the lesser of evils getting vaccinated, but you just worry being a first generation so young getting a vaccine. So we want them to be vaccinated to be safe, but you still worry about where does that go one day? And we're not vaccine hesitant. So the whole thing is petrifying once it starts to affect kids. At the very start of this pandemic, when it was all about the rest of us a bit older, you felt like your kids were to some extent safe, but now you feel like they're the most vulnerable, and it is as scary as hell as a parent. All parents know that.
Well, once that information comes through, everyone has to be absolutely clear about the messaging, so we've got the right information.
Absolutely. Well, to the Gold Coast now, where Mayor Tom Tate couldn't wait to share this good news about the fight against a threat that every Aussie is facing.
So, wonderful day today. We've got the latest technology to combat the hoons.
That's right. I mean, who cares about a pandemic when there's a hoondemic?